What is the most dangerous betrayal? Is it the obvious enemy who attacks from the front? Or is it the trusted friend who listens to your deepest secrets? Today's story takes us to medieval Prague, in the shadow of the Great Western Schism. We will witness how a young courtier discovered that loneliness could be weaponized more effectively than any sword. When powerful men desperately craved the one thing their positions made impossible, genuine friendship. With a lesson he learned from studying human isolation, he would perfect the art of manufactured intimacy that destroys from within. This story will reveal the most insidious secret of espionage, a secret discovered 600 years ago, but still used by the most sophisticated intelligence operations in today's world. It is not those who steal information through force or bribery who cause the greatest damage, but those who earn it through the patient cultivation of trust, making their victims grateful for the very relationship that destroys them. In the shadow-draped halls of medieval Prague, where Gothic spires pierced the winter sky like prayers frozen in stone, there lived a truth more dangerous than any blade. In a world where secrets determine the fate of nations, the one who masters the art of false friendship becomes the most deadly predator of all. For when kings and nobles, merchants and clergy all guard their deepest secrets while yearning for someone they can trust completely, the perfect friend who listens with infinite patience becomes the perfect spy who destroys with surgical precision. The year was 1378, and the Holy Roman Empire was fracturing under the weight of the Great Western Schism, a crisis that had divided not only the Church, but the entire political structure of medieval Europe. Within this labyrinth of shifting loyalties and desperate alliances, a young Bohemian courtier named Václav Krejčí faced an opportunity that would test not only his capacity for deception, but his understanding of how human loneliness could be weaponized more effectively than any army. At 31, Václav possessed the social skills that had secured him entry into Prague's complex court society. He could navigate the intricate protocols of noble interaction, had mastered the art of conversation that revealed nothing while appearing to share everything, and possessed the kind of warm, engaging personality that made people feel immediately comfortable in his presence. But Václav had also discovered something that his more honest colleagues seemed to overlook. In a world where everyone was surrounded by potential enemies, the person who could convincingly play the role of a true friend possessed access to secrets that could topple kingdoms. The insight had come during his service to Emperor Charles IV, when Václav observed how the most powerful men in Europe were simultaneously the most isolated. Surrounded by courtiers who wanted something from them, advisors whose loyalty was always questionable, and family members whose affection was complicated by inheritance concerns, these rulers desperately craved the kind of genuine friendship that their positions made almost impossible to achieve. But what Václav realized was that this desperate hunger for authentic connection created an extraordinary vulnerability that could be exploited by someone who understood the psychology of loneliness and the art of manufactured intimacy. The strategy began to crystallize when Václav was assigned to serve as liaison with Duke Rudolf Habsburg, who controlled territories that were crucial to imperial trade routes, but whose loyalty to the empire had become increasingly questionable as various factions competed for his allegiance. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed because Duke Rudolf was too sophisticated to be influenced by obvious political pressure and too wealthy to be swayed by conventional bribes or incentives. But Václav recognized that Duke Rudolf suffered from the same isolation that plagued all powerful men of his era. Despite his wealth and authority, he was surrounded by people who related to his position rather than his person, creating a profound loneliness that made him vulnerable to anyone who could provide the illusion of genuine friendship and understanding. Václav's approach was masterful in its subtlety. Instead of presenting himself as an imperial representative seeking Duke Rudolf's political support, he positioned himself as someone who was genuinely interested in the Duke as an individual. His thoughts, his concerns, his perspectives on the complex challenges facing European nobility during this period of unprecedented uncertainty. The cultivation began with seemingly casual conversations during formal court functions, where Václav demonstrated remarkable skill at asking questions that drew Duke Rudolf into discussions about his personal interests and concerns rather than political matters. Václav showed genuine fascination with the Duke's intellectual pursuits, his collection of manuscripts, his concerns about the future of his territories, and his philosophical reflections on leadership and responsibility. More importantly, Václav gradually began to share what appeared to be his own personal thoughts and concerns, creating the impression of mutual vulnerability and trust that forms the foundation of genuine friendship. He confided his own doubts about imperial politics, his concerns about his career prospects, and his philosophical questions about loyalty and honor in an age of shifting alliances. Over the course of several months, what began as formal diplomatic interaction evolved into what Duke Rudolf believed was the first genuine friendship he'd experienced in years. Václav became someone the Duke looked forward to seeing, someone whose opinions he valued, and someone with whom he could discuss matters that he would never share with other imperial representatives or his own advisors. The psychological foundation of this manufactured friendship was Václav's extraordinary ability to make Duke Rudolf feel heard, understood, and valued as an individual rather than merely as a political asset. In their private conversations, Václav demonstrated the kind of empathetic listening that made the Duke feel that his thoughts and concerns were genuinely important to someone whose judgment he respected. But beneath this carefully constructed intimacy, Václav was systematically gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable to imperial strategy. Through casual questions and sympathetic listening, he learned about Duke Rudolf's military capabilities, his financial resources, his relationships with other nobles, and most importantly, his private thoughts about various political developments that were shaping European politics. The brilliance of Václav's approach was that Duke Rudolf never experienced their interactions as interrogations or intelligence gathering. Instead, he felt that he was sharing his thoughts with a trusted friend who provided valuable perspective and emotional support during a particularly challenging period in European history. More insidiously, Václav began to use his intimate knowledge of Duke Rudolf's psychology to subtly influence his thinking and decision-making. Through carefully timed conversations and strategically chosen topics, Václav could plant ideas that Duke Rudolf would later believe had emerged from his own analysis and reflection. The true sophistication of Václav's manipulation became apparent when he began to engineer situations where Duke Rudolf's growing trust in their friendship would lead him to make decisions that served imperial interests, while believing that he was acting according to his own independent judgment and values. When tensions arose between Duke Rudolf and neighboring nobles who were aligned with rival factions, Václav provided sympathetic support and strategic advice that helped the Duke navigate these conflicts successfully. But the advice was carefully crafted to ensure that Duke Rudolf's victories would enhance imperial influence while weakening potential threats to imperial authority. The psychological manipulation was so subtle that Duke Rudolf genuinely believed that Václav was helping him advance his own interests rather than serving imperial strategy. The friendship felt authentic because Václav's assistance was genuinely helpful, even though it was designed to serve larger objectives that Duke Rudolf didn't fully understand. The culmination of this phase of Václav's operation came when Duke Rudolf faced pressure from French representatives who were attempting to secure his support for anti-imperial policies that would have significantly damaged Habsburg interests throughout Central Europe. Instead of responding with obvious counter-pressure or competing offers, Václav orchestrated a campaign of friendly influence that led Duke Rudolf to reject the French overtures while believing that he was acting according to his own analysis of what would best serve his territories. The conversation that sealed Duke Rudolf's fate took place during a private evening in the Duke's personal chambers, where Václav had been invited for what had become their regular discussions about politics, philosophy, and the challenges of leadership during turbulent times. The setting was intimate and informal, with wine and the kind of relaxed atmosphere that encouraged personal disclosure. Duke Rudolf, feeling the warm glow of wine and friendship, began to confide his deepest concerns about the political situation throughout the empire. He shared intelligence about French diplomatic initiatives that he had received through his own network of contacts, revealed his assessment of various nobles' true loyalties, and most damagingly, disclosed his own long-term strategy for maintaining his territory's independence during what he believed would be an inevitable reorganization of imperial authority. From Václav's perspective, this conversation represented the ultimate success of his patient cultivation strategy. Duke Rudolf was voluntarily providing detailed intelligence about French strategy, the political reliability of other imperial nobles, and his own plans for responding to various potential scenarios, information that would be invaluable for imperial planning and could potentially be used to neutralize threats before they could develop into serious challenges. But the most sophisticated aspect of the intelligence gathering was that Duke Rudolf experienced the conversation as a moment of deep personal connection with someone he trusted completely. He felt that sharing his concerns and strategies with Václav was a natural expression of their friendship rather than a catastrophic security breach that had provided the imperial court with detailed knowledge of his vulnerabilities and intentions. The intelligence that Václav gathered during this and subsequent intimate conversations enabled the imperial court to anticipate and counter Duke Rudolf's strategies while maintaining the appearance of responding to developments rather than acting on inside information. When Duke Rudolf attempted to build alliances with other potentially disloyal nobles, imperial representatives somehow always seemed to offer better alternatives, just as those negotiations were reaching critical stages. When Duke Rudolf tried to diversify his political relationships by developing closer ties with foreign courts, he consistently found that imperial policies were adjusted in ways that made such relationships less attractive, while making continued loyalty to the empire more beneficial. The timing was so perfect that Duke Rudolf never suspected that his private strategic planning was being systematically undermined by someone with access to his most confidential thoughts and intentions. More perversely, Duke Rudolf often discussed these frustrating political developments with Václav, seeking his friend's perspective on why his carefully planned initiatives kept encountering unexpected obstacles. Václav provided sympathetic support and strategic advice that helped Duke Rudolf cope with these setbacks, while ensuring that his responses would continue to serve imperial interests. The relationship had become a perfectly closed loop of manipulation, where Duke Rudolf's trust in his friend made him vulnerable to intelligence gathering that enabled strategies that frustrated his objectives, leading him to seek more support and advice from the very person who was orchestrating his difficulties. The ultimate betrayal came during the crisis of 1379, when Pope Urban VI's increasingly erratic behavior threatened to destabilize the entire structure of church authority throughout Europe. Duke Rudolf, like many powerful nobles, faced pressure to declare his position on competing papal claims, a decision that could determine not just his relationship with church hierarchy, but his political alliances throughout the continent. In private conversations with Václav, Duke Rudolf revealed that he was considering supporting Clement VII, the Avignon Pope, as part of a broader strategy to distance his territories from imperial control and align himself with French interests. This intelligence was exactly what imperial strategists needed to prevent a potentially catastrophic defection that could encourage other nobles to question their loyalty to the empire. But instead of responding with obvious pressure or threats, imperial representatives orchestrated a sophisticated campaign that used Duke Rudolf's trust in Václav to manipulate his decision-making process. Through carefully staged conversations and strategically revealed information, Václav influenced Duke Rudolf's analysis of the situation in ways that made supporting the Roman Pope appear to be the optimal strategy for protecting his territories and advancing his long-term interests. The manipulation was so effective that Duke Rudolf ultimately made his declaration of support for Urban VI, while believing that he had reached this decision through his own careful analysis of the political situation. Guided by advice from his most trusted friend, he never suspected that his decision had been systematically engineered by imperial agents who had used his friendship with Václav to shape his understanding of the options and consequences he was evaluating. The success of Václav's operation established him as one of the most valuable intelligence assets in imperial service. But it also revealed to him the devastating psychological costs of his methods. Duke Rudolf continued to regard Václav as his closest friend and most trusted advisor, regularly seeking his counsel and sharing his most private thoughts and concerns. But every interaction was now poisoned by the knowledge that this trusted relationship was actually a carefully constructed deception designed to serve interests that were fundamentally opposed to Duke Rudolf's own. The psychological sophistication required to maintain such a relationship over extended periods was extraordinary. Václav had to convincingly simulate genuine affection and concern, while systematically betraying the trust that made such affection possible. He had to provide helpful advice and emotional support while ensuring that his assistance ultimately served objectives that Duke Rudolf would have opposed if he had understood their true nature. But perhaps most troubling was Václav's growing realization that his simulation of friendship had become so convincing that he sometimes experienced moments of genuine affection and concern for Duke Rudolf. The prolonged intimacy required for effective intelligence gathering had created psychological bonds that complicated his ability to maintain the emotional distance necessary for successful manipulation. This created a form of psychological torture, where Václav was simultaneously the manipulator and a victim of his own manipulation. Caring about someone he was systematically betraying while maintaining relationships that required him to experience genuine emotions that made his betrayal more rather than less painful. The long-term consequences of Václav's success extended far beyond the immediate intelligence benefits to imperial strategy. His methods became a template for intelligence operations throughout the Habsburg territories, creating a systematic approach to infiltration and manipulation that relied on manufactured intimacy rather than traditional espionage techniques. The approach proved remarkably effective because it exploited fundamental human needs that even the most paranoid and sophisticated targets found difficult to resist. Everyone needed friendship, understanding, and emotional support, especially people in positions of power who were constantly surrounded by individuals whose loyalty was questionable and whose motives were transparently self-serving. By providing apparent friendship that felt genuine while actually serving intelligence objectives, operatives trained in Václav's methods could gain access to information and influence that would be impossible to achieve through conventional espionage. The intimacy required for effective friendship created opportunities for intelligence gathering and psychological manipulation that were far more powerful than anything available through traditional spy networks. But the success of these methods also revealed their ethical costs. The systematic betrayal of trust that was necessary for this approach to intelligence gathering created psychological damage not just for targets, but for operatives who had to maintain convincing performances of affection while systematically exploiting the relationships they appeared to value. In our modern world of social media and digital communication, this medieval wisdom has become both more relevant and more dangerous than ever before. We live in an age where loneliness and social isolation are epidemic, making people more vulnerable than ever to those who would exploit their need for connection and understanding. The most sophisticated forms of modern espionage and manipulation often rely on the same principles that guided Václav over 6 centuries ago. Social engineering attacks that compromise corporate security, political influence operations that shape public opinion, and personal manipulation that exploits individual vulnerabilities all depend on the ability to simulate genuine relationship while actually serving hidden agendas. This doesn't mean that all friendship is suspect or that every kind person has ulterior motives, but rather that we must develop more sophisticated understanding of how genuine human needs can be exploited by those who understand the psychology of trust and intimacy. The most effective defense against such manipulation is not paranoid suspicion of everyone, but rather the development of better judgment about the difference between relationships that serve mutual interests and those that exploit one person's needs to serve another's hidden agenda. Whether you're evaluating new relationships, assessing the motivations of people who seem unusually interested in your thoughts and concerns, or simply trying to protect yourself from those who would exploit your natural desire for friendship and understanding. The principles of defensive psychology remain as important today as they were in medieval Prague. For in the Gothic halls of Prague Castle, Václav Krejčí learned that the most devastating betrayals are those that come disguised as the very relationships we most desperately need. And in that dark knowledge lies both a warning and a strategy. True friendship is precious, precisely because false friendship is so easy to manufacture. And the person who can distinguish between them holds the keys to both security and influence, in a world where trust is the most dangerous gift anyone can offer.